we start off with Gavin about MinSouth, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Gavin Bowyer. I'm one of the members of the Council of MinSouth. And MinSouth is a local mining industry technical society, although we meet in the pub, of the Institute of Materials, Minerals and Mining. Now, Institute, or IOM3, it's easier to say, is a, you can tell by the names, a body which has merged from various parts of industry. And the first body that formed, that was 150 years ago, the Institute of Iron and Steel, and this year is the 150th anniversary of the IOM3, and this evening's meeting in MinSouth have badged as our meeting towards the celebration of those 150 years. Now, MinSouth itself is a merged body. We date back not quite that far, although some of us do. It was 1958, the Institute of Mining Engineers had a local branch in the southeast. A bit later, the Institution of Mining and Metallurgy in the mid-90s formed a local branch. When the two parent bodies merged, we merged, and then the parent body, which was then the Institution of Mining and Metallurgy, merged into the IOM3. And in the early 2000s, rather than call ourselves the Institute of this, this and this, we decided to call ourselves MinSouth. So, MinSouth, we hold monthly meetings, usually on the second Monday of the month, from, it varies a bit, but usually September through to about June. And most of the meetings are held here on the second Monday of the month. And we also have a website, as everybody does, minsouth.org.uk, which is actually on this pen, which I'll be handing around with the attendance sheet. So any more details you can find there, including how to become a member of MinSouth. Now, there's two ways. Either you become directly a member, or if you happen to be a member of the parent body, then you nominate MinSouth as the local society we would like to support. And if you did want to become a member of the parent body, we do have some membership forms on the table around the corner, with a few more pens to remind you of the website. And as I say, started, I'm a member of the MinSouth Council. We do have vacancies on council. So come September, or October, when we hold our AGM, an opportunity to get involved with the meetings we organise as well as your own. But that apart, more than welcome to any of our meetings, and look to our website, and then you will find those meetings, hopefully other meetings of like-minded bodies. Back to you, Sue.
Thanks very much. Just before I call Elizabeth to talk about women in mining, just to advertise our next meeting, which will be our final one for the year, because our year runs from September, October, right the way through to June, and that's our last one over the summer. But June the 10th, it's on the website if you need to remind yourself. We have our prestige lecture, which will be Neil Wells, who's ex-RSM, but he's currently the chair of, I can't say this properly, CRIRCSCO. Thank you. And also deputy chair of PrSciNat. And he's going to be talking about resource reporting codes, so it's relevant to everybody in the industry. So it's going to be a really good one. 6 p.m, 10th of June, and that's going to be held at the IOM headquarters in Euston Road. Okay. So can I ask Elizabeth to have a quick chat about ocean mining? That would be great. Thank you. Elizabeth,
thank you very much, Sue. Hello, everyone. I am Elizabeth Johnson, as Sue said. I head up the events committee for women in mining in the UK. We are an organisation that was set up about 12 years ago or so, quite probably longer, but has really got going in the last 6 years. It was set up to promote and expand women's knowledge in the sector, knowledge, and also promote them in the industry. We have regular events which we put on throughout the year, roughly one a month, and we are delighted this month to be partnering with MinSouth, so thank you very much for the opportunity. We really do appreciate it. We are streaming this event, so if any of you want to catch up or if you missed a bit later on, you can go to our website and catch up there. What else can I tell you? We have our next event is going to be a mentoring event. We are always looking for people who, especially with a technical background, who would like to come and mentor the next generation of would-be geologists and mining engineers and everything else that is attached to the mining industry. So if you are keen to come and see me afterwards, the next event is a dinner on the 16th, so that's actually next week. No, this week, isn't it? Losing track of time. And we have our summer drinks, which is on June the 19th. Again, you can register at our website. You'll find all the information about us, more information and information on our events on the website. Do follow us on Twitter, we're on Facebook, LinkedIn, all the social media you could possibly ever want. And yes, we will. We'd love to see you at more of our events, and we'd love to do more with you as well. So thank you very much. Thank you, Fiona, in advance. I hope you'll have a very good evening, and yeah, do take advantage of the free bar. We're delighted to sponsor it.
Thank you. This is the second year that we've had our May meeting as a combined with green engineers, green mining. So I'm hoping that this will become a regular slot. Okay, so let's get on to the main event. So thank you very much, Fiona, for agreeing to do this. So just a way of brief introduction. Fiona Cessford has been with SRK just 20 years now. She's just had her 20th anniversary. Has headed up the environmental group, which is now being taken over by Jane. So I think Fiona's going to introduce Jane as well. But in a lot of that time, correct me if I'm wrong, hundreds probably of ESIA studies, either undertaking them, managing them, or reviewing them, and definitely talking about how they align with the mining process as well. So without further ado, Fiona, on to you.
Very much so. Right, let's see if technology will behave itself. I'm going to shift myself very slightly this way so I'm not in your way. There we go. So as Sue mentioned, I'm very lucky in that I have a part of a really good team in Cardiff with SRK, and two of that team are here today. And I'd like to introduce them. So Jane Jochen, who currently heads up the environmental and social team, she and I have worked together for the 20 years that I've been with SRK. She actually started out as my mentor, one of my mentors, before having a break to have kids, and then came back to SRK. And what's very fascinating about the way we work is that we look at things very differently, but we usually end up at the same solution. And we make a really good team because we're constantly bouncing things off of each other, and quite a lot of what's in this presentation is thanks to Jane, so I want to acknowledge that now. Alice Davies, sitting next to Jane, is another one of our team. She started with us fresh from university and has been with us 7 years now, and is now project managing environmental impact assessments on her own, with a bit of bossing about by me and Jane. And I need to thank her because later on in the presentation I'm giving two case studies, an initial case study and a second case study. And the second one is very much with thanks to Alice and her hard work. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use some case studies. I'm going to unfortunately give you a little bit of very boring history about why ESIA and project development studies are so important, and then give you the benefits of why I think we should amalgamate and work together, and then tell you a little bit about how that can best be achieved. Okay, this very scary looking slide is not something I'm going to spend any time on. it's highly idealized, but what I really want to get across is that the project development process at the top and the ESIA process at the bottom are completely interactive. That's how we would like it to be, and I'm going to come back to this slide later on. So the bad example. Now, there are some photos in here. I'm not telling you which country it's in. I'm not telling you who the client is, because I don't want to get into trouble. If you recognize anything, I don't think you'll get the project, but if you recognize the country or anything like that, please just keep it to yourselves. That would be very gratefully appreciated. So, my bad case study. It started with a kickoff meeting held in a country other than the one where the project was located. And I sat down with the owners and the project management team, and we were bashing out the final details of the scope of work that we were to implement and the contract that needed to go with it. And they were trying to squeeze us on costs. We're consultants, we expect that. But what happened was that they said categorically, your site visit time is too long, you don't need to be on site that much. And I'm going, well, it's quite important that, you know, we need to have these meetings with the communities and have a look around and get orientated. They go, oh, there's no communities. This is what no communities looks like. These three are in the footprint of the deposit. This one, admittedly not in the footprint of the deposit, but it was only a few kilometers away. We didn't find this out until we arrived on site the very first time. So to give you a little bit of extra context, the project was in an area with very high rainfall variability. That meant that droughts were very common, so water stress was a key issue for the project. There were endemic birds, there was a conservation area not too far away. The landscape was modified by the communities that weren't there. There were lots of artisanal miners, and there was an extremely, extremely complex socio-political situation, not just in the project area, but in the country as a whole. So what did this mean in terms of the challenges for the ESIA? Well, they were pushing us to finish an ESIA on something that they were calling a pre-feasibility study. But in reality, based on all the work that I've done with the mining engineers and the resource and reserve geologists in the past, I think it would barely rank as a conceptual study. We were told that water, groundwater, surface water, groundwater, and geochemistry would be done by the project engineers, and we'd be handed their reports that we could use for the impact assessment. So we nag and we nag and we nag and we get nothing. Eventually something arrives on our desk, and it's basically a literature search with absolutely no information. Well, in terms of good environmental and social impact assessment process, we applied the precautionary principle. So when the draft document comes out, of course the management team weren't very happy because everything was probably slightly overstated, but we didn't know where the water was coming from, we didn't know how they were going to manage it, we didn't know what they were going to be discharging, we knew nothing. And because the communities didn't think, because the mining company didn't think communities were important, they hadn't really gone in and sensitized the communities about what was going on. So the first time we arrived to do the consultation for the ESIA, of course, this was just opening the doors to the floodgates in terms of complaints that had arisen during the exploration process and their land that had been disturbed and all these things that the company had promised us were not going to be an issue for this project. There were many other challenges for this project, not just on the environmental and social side, and needless to say, to this day, this project hasn't gone anywhere. So that's my bad case study. Now a little bit of boring history. So, my bad case study definitely falls into this category. I thought I'd give you another very brief case study. We were involved in a project in the Middle East. Again, not going to mention which country it was in. One of my colleagues was reviewing, doing a third-party review as part of a multidisciplinary project, and was reviewing the ESIA for this new project. And as she was reading this, she was going, this looks really, really familiar. She kept on reading and she kept on reading, and eventually she came to Jane and I, and she opened this report and she said, does this look familiar to you? And Jane went, yes, it does. What this project had done is taken an ESIA that SRK had been involved in about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years previously, for a project 70 kilometers away, and literally cut and paste all the information from this other ESIA and applied it to this new project without permission. It was so bad that the boreholes and their coordinates and their naming still had our naming and coordinate system for a project that was over 70 kilometers away. It had been approved, and they were operating in accordance with this document that was designed around a project that it had nothing to do with. So, although environmental impact assessment has been around since the 1960s in a number of countries, I guess the real thrust of the idea of the environmental and social input working closely with the project design team in order to have a successful project really came about in the 1990s with various things like the Rio Declaration and the Espoo Convention. But it seems to me that the project design teams took a little while to kind of come to grips with this concept. So the next stage in the history lesson was basically, okay, we see that there's some benefit to working with you guys, but you just give us the criteria. You stay over there, you do your stuff over there, and you give us things, and then we'll make sure that everything's okay, and we'll design around it. But it was a one-way street, where what we really want to do is get to this two-way street where we work together. And we're very, very lucky in that many, in fact most, the majority of our clients definitely fall into this category. We wouldn't be doing the work that we do if we didn't have this way of interacting. And the case study at the end will give you a good example of this. So what are the challenges that happen to affect that ideal relationship? So the first thing I want to mention, I'll come back, I'll just leave it, is requests to fast track the ESIA. One of the main reasons we see for this is the need to convert an exploration license into an exploitation license. It's so often left to the very last minute, and the mining companies or the exploration project owners need to get this thing converted, and they'll come to a consultant and they'll say, can you produce an ESIA for us in 3 to 6 months so that we don't lose our license? In that same time, they're doing the same thing on the feasibility side. They're generating a technical document called a feasibility study, which bears no resemblance to a feasibility study the way we would think of a bankable feasibility study. And it's all done in order to fast track this approval process. And we dread these. We hate these kind of requests because it means that the ESIA is going to be superficial at best, and it certainly isn't going to be reliable for any future project development. The next issue or challenge is localization. One way to achieve that is to use local consultants. And the problem with often the consultants that may be based within a country, particularly if it's a country that doesn't have a large mining industry, is that they've got a very broad generalist experience. They may not understand the specific issues and challenges that are associated with a mining project. And it means that they may not be able to identify the material risks to the project and instead focus on unimportant issues. So what we find with such studies is there's a lovely description of how general waste management will happen. You know, that there'll be a landfill and there'll be separation of wastes and this, that, and the other, but they haven't even talked about acid rock drainage and metal leaching. So the focus is often not where it needs to be. Another aspect to see with localization is that I think mining project teams think it's easy to find local environmental and social specialists that they can appoint within their corporate team to manage these issues. It's also often a good way to promote women, because the best thing about our profession is that we are dominated by women in the environmental and social field. But my experience is that although these people will be highly experienced and very skilled, either because culturally or for whatever reason, they may not be willing to stand up for themselves, and there may be quite a significant lack of respect for and a willingness to listen to what they have to say. In other countries where we work, localization is less of an issue. It's accepted that there's a very thriving industry, especially where there's big mining projects across the country. But what we see there is a silo mentality. So we see that the environmental people work in one little group, and if there is a community group, which doesn't always happen, they work in another group, and then you've got the mining guys, and then you've got the process guys, and then maybe you've got some engineering kind of general civils guys. And none of these groups talk to each other. Everything has to go up the chain, and then one little person sits there at the top, makes decisions, and sends everything back down again. And because communication is key to a really successful project, this silo mentality can be a real block. The last one I want to talk about is development with intent to sell on. It's a fact. It's reality in the mining industry that this happens. The problem comes in that the people who are developing the project, if they know they're going to sell it on, have no vested interest in the long-term viability of that project. All they're interested in is adding value and selling it on to the next company, and it's then their problems. And the planning team may well be a group of international specialists. You know, you might have your process guys sitting in Australia, and your mining guys sitting in Canada, and your water guys in the UK, and you're using perhaps a local consultant to do the impact assessment. And then because of either language or logistics, these people are just not talking to each other. And so we get these problems, and there's limited chance of a project being successfully implemented. And when things are being developed like this, they often want to comply with the host country requirements only, particularly where the project's being financed, self-financed, where you're not bringing in the international lenders and things like that that will influence good international industry practice. There may be limited stakeholder consultation because they don't really care whether the stakeholders get upset. They just want to get it through to this first stage. And they may also be slightly more blasé about the risks because they're not going to be the ones that have to build and operate the mine. So what are some of the influences that affect projects? I suspect most of you guys are familiar with the concept and initiatives in this slide. And what does this actually mean in practice? Okay, don't be scared by this. This is a slide that Jane and I created a few years ago and have more recently updated because there's been some new things that are coming in that we wanted to add new trends. One of them is the Sustainable Development Goals, and another one is the consumer pressures that influence the projects. So what does this all mean? Well, at the top, you've basically got kind of everything that comes out of the declarations, conventions, and treaties. Now, these feed in two ways. One through national law, which then applies through regulations and standards and the permits that are applied to a project. This is the poor little project in the middle. This poor thing is surrounded by all of this. And this is just environmental and social. We're not even bringing in the technical and economic challenges that a project has to face. On this side, you've got kind of what is now accepted practice, either by industry or just generally, which then applies through the project financing process. And what we have is good guidelines here, cyanide management code, industry-specific ones. Along here, equator principles, IFC performance standards. through consumer pressure, things like the Gold Council and what they're trying to do with the diamonds and the Kimberley stuff. And then you've got the stakeholders throwing in their 2 pence wherever they can put a pressure on a project. So it's hard. It's hard to develop a project when you're taking all of this into account. And then, although not necessarily specific to a project development study, what we're seeing more and more is that projects that are listing on stock exchange, the investors are getting more sensitive towards environmental and social governance aspects. And they're looking for green or safe investments. And so for a number of the stock exchanges, they're bringing out environmental and social governance guidelines. And I think this is going to be something that's going to affect mainly the bigger projects, but certainly anything that's operational and has external shareholders. So we talked about the Combined Reserves International Reporting Standards Committee, which is Sue. Sariska. Here's some examples. What they require is for a competent person's report that it must take into account modifying factors. And modifying factors include environmental, social, legal, as well as the obvious technical issues that come into play. And depending on which of the various things we're looking at, the types of modifying factors that they want to talk about are the, the existing environmental liabilities, so particularly for brownfield sites where these are being developed. Community agreements applicable where, for example, you might have indigenous people. Environmental studies, so that's your ESIA. Material, environmental, and social issues. And that might include things like geochemical, how you manage your tailings, it's a big issue at the moment, and water management. And then lastly, of course, mine closure. JORC code goes as far as to say what we should be doing at different levels of project studies. So for the PFS, it says that you've got to have things kind of well advanced. What we see quite often, though, is we're being pushed to finalize our ESIAs based on a PFS level study. And as we've heard, that poses its own challenges, and I'm going to talk more about that later on. For an FS, the expectation is that either you'll have obtained your environmental approval, which means you've probably finished your ESIA, or that it's significantly advanced. Now, it doesn't have to be done before you finish your feasibility studies, but there are a number of large corporates that have stage gates, I'm using that term, that say that you've got to have it finished before you can sign off on a feasibility study. So each project is different, but certainly you need to be very, very well advanced with your impact assessment. So where do we see current trends? I talked earlier about localization and the risks that it poses and the challenge that it poses, but it also is a really great opportunity. Whenever we work on a project, we try to find a local partner. We recognize the benefit of working with local consultants and the local knowledge that they bring. We cannot be experts in every single country that we operate in. We can only do this if we work together with people within that country. In terms of the impact assessment process, there's been a number of recent environmental impact assessment conferences, the IAIA Mining Symposium in December, which Alice presented at. Is anyone else there? Yeah, we've got some lots of back. And the more recent one in Brisbane, which I didn't attend, but one of my colleagues did, and then given us some very useful feedback. And so some of the trends that we're seeing here is the focus on sustainability-based assessments. Now, already we talk about the positives and the negatives in an impact assessment, but a sustainability-based assessment is really trying to pull out the long-term benefit of a project and balance that with the negative. It's saying, we acknowledge there is negative and this is the positive, which means we need to be focusing more on the opportunities and the positives than we have done in the past. Proportional impact assessment, this is one of the ones that I feel quite strongly about. This is basically saying that your impact assessment should be risk-based. So don't go around and study everything to the nth degree just so you can tick a box. Let us, at an initial stage in the process, which we call the scoping stage, just like you do for a engineering study, so a scoping or a concept or a PEA, you go and you look at what the issues are, and that's where you focus your attention. It's exactly the same for an impact assessment. And what we want to do is make sure that the studies are appropriate. Now, there are some challenges to that, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute when we talk about the increased capacity of stakeholders. The last thing that we're really seeing with respect to the impact assessment process is increased emphasis on cumulative impacts and strategic assessments. Now, these can only happen if the company is working with the government. They can't be company driven, they have to be government driven. And in some countries that's happening. There is this idea of looking at a project area holistically, but it's still a challenge in others. I'll mention a country here, Guinea. Guinea has huge potential for bauxite. There are concessions everywhere. Everybody's looking at where are they going to put their port and their railway line and their road, and it's all being looked at isolated. What it really needs to be done is looked at holistically, but no one company is ever going to volunteer to do that. It's just not practical. So moving on to the increased capacity of stakeholders. They are very much aware of their rights. I think we're all familiar with the press that's coming out of countries in South America, but we're seeing it more and more in Africa and Central Asia. And in Europe, and Jane's had some experience of this, the increased capacity of stakeholders means that through the freedom of information rights that they have through European law, that they can demand any information that has involved the regulators. And so what that's doing is almost creating a barrier to transparency, because the companies don't want to communicate with the regulators in case they give away information that the stakeholders can at a later stage use against them. So the other issue, I come back around to the proportional impact assessment. You just don't know what issues the stakeholders are going to pick up, and so you have to study everything in order to make sure that you satisfy all the stakeholders, even if realistically it's not a key issue. And what happens is that you end up with trust being in short supply and emotion rather than science driving decision making. And a good example of this can be seen in the UK with the current arguments over fracking. Linked to this increased awareness, there's a dichotomy between the regulators who need to make planning decisions for new projects and the fact that at the time this decision needs to be made, projects are often still at a development stage. They're doing trade-off studies. They're looking at the different alternatives, and the project description is probably changing on a weekly basis. So in some countries, you get two key stages of approval. You get a planning permission, followed by a separate environmental authorization. In others, these processes are integrally linked. Now, where the processes are linked, the challenge for the company is they don't want to invest huge amounts of money in doing very detailed engineering studies if there's no chance of a project being approved, or a certain aspect of that project is not going to be approved and they're going to have to change everything. But in order to get the project approved, even at the initial planning stage, they're being asked for huge amounts of detail. And so you get this vicious cycle of trying to satisfy stakeholders, government, and the company. Where the planning and the environmental approval processes are separated, Sweden is an example, the challenge is that the initial environmental and social study, which is supposed to be high level and just informing a general planning decision, ends up being way too detailed. And then lastly, as a result of this increased scrutiny, there is pressure on governments to ensure that companies are complying with their statutory requirements. And this applies very much to operational mines, but it's very important that new projects are thinking about this ahead of time, so that when they can show to the regulator and to their stakeholders how they're going to be able to meet their commitments should this project become operational. Okay, that's the background. We've heard about the theory, we've heard about the justification, but what are the benefits? Well, obvious one is cost savings. One of the best examples of this is for water studies, where what you get is, if you're very clever and you plan this up front, you can get the guys that are doing the hydrology, the guys that are doing the hydrogeology, and possibly the climate, to make sure that the data they're generating is good for the ESIA and good for the project engineering. You don't have to have two separate studies, you only need one study, but it's important that both of the intended audiences are inputting into that scope of work so that the scope of work is appropriate. By ensuring that these studies are done together, you can avoid double handling. Another example is, let's take exploration drilling. There's a lot of data that can be gathered in terms of geotechnical and hydrogeological information when the exploration drilling is occurring, but the drillers need to be trained and asked to make sure that they look for certain things and then report this and record it. So all this can save a lot of money in the long run, but it needs some upfront thinking. Cost savings can also be achieved if the project doesn't have to be redesigned to address environmental and social constraints. So if there's a strong two-way communication, that sacred tree that's located in the concession can be avoided by possibly shifting the waste rock dump a little bit. It's probably not going to make a massive difference to the cost, but it can make a really, really big difference to your relationship with the community. Probably the most common issue we come up with when reviewing projects for financial institutions is that the project description bears very little resemblance. The project description in the ESIA bears very little resemblance to what's in the feasibility study, and I can see Wardle Armstrong laughing at the back. They've had this. I don't think we have ever done a large environmental and social impact assessment where we were getting requested to change the project description on the day we went to press. We can't do that. It doesn't work that way. So the closer we work together, the more confidence we're going to have that the outcome is going to be good, and that we won't have to either update the ESIA at a later date or in some cases completely rewrite the whole ESIA because things have changed so much. I once worked on a project where the location of the port moved 4 times in less than 18 months. Now, we're supposed to gather all the seasonal data. That ideally means a year's worth of data, and they keep moving the port. So we go and we say, right, let's assess this area. And we're not talking, 20 meters or something. We're talking 30 kilometers. And it makes a big difference to the studies. Well, look, stakeholder opposition will always be a risk. But if the project can clearly show how their issues and concerns have been addressed, then social license is easier to obtain. When everything aligns, hopefully, the approval process becomes simpler, and the conditions of approval that ultimately come out of the approval process will be realistic. That's what we're striving to achieve. Coming back to money, we know that that's all important to all of our project engineers here and accountants. A close working relationship between the teams will increase the confidence in the project valuation. it means that the corporate decision makers and any potential investors for the project are going to be happy that the numbers are realistic and there's not going to be any curveballs coming later on. When we design and do project engineering for a feasibility study, we set the percentage accuracy we expect, whether it's 10, 20, whatever percentage that that project is seeking to achieve. We set that percentage of accuracy. The costs associated with environmental and social issues should be done to the same level of accuracy, particularly if there's a potential for them to be material over the life of the project. The obvious example of this is things to do with closure, but it doesn't always have to be. It could be resettlement, it could be design of the tailings dam. Any of these have the potential to be material. Lastly, key benefit, it's the foundation for a successful operation that is operationally implementable, and all your little minions will be happy. Okay, so now I've persuaded all of you that working together is the right solution. How do we achieve this in practice? So here's some tools that can help with this process. We've talked a lot about a robust environmental and social impact assessment. So some of the things that can be done to help with that are requesting your consultants to generate environmental and social design criteria reports. So what are these? These are short documents for the project engineers that list, for example, the likely emission standards that are going to be applied in that country. That might be done by taking any local regulations for, let's take air emissions, comparing it with the standards of the IFC performance standard, environmental health and safety guidelines, and any other guidelines that may be appropriate to that project. And saying, right, this is the number we think is appropriate and for this reason. And this is the project standard, and this is what we want you to design to. It will also include things that relate to the ambient environment, so the receiving water quality or the receiving air quality. And that helps the impact assessment when it comes along to figure out how significant any exceedances or things might be. Second thing is I need to give you some bullets, there we go. Sensitivity maps. Sensitivity maps are great. You can put on a sensitivity map anything that is relevant to that project. It may be habitats, it may be where the local communities are based, it may be where there's a cultural site, it could be where there's water resources that are important. I mean, anything, and you can layer this up. And with the fancy things you can do now with PDFs, you can send somebody a PDF that you can turn and click layers on and off. And these engineers just love it. They can look at a picture and they can go, right, we can put it there. There's nothing there. That's fine. That's a good location. If we get this to them early enough, fast enough, it will really help the project engineers. Jane says engineers don't read reports. If you do have to write a report for the engineers, very short. Ideally, 1 or 2 pages at most with some pretty pictures. They like that. It's about as much as they can cope with. Sorry to the engineers in the audience. We love writing reports, and we know you guys hate reading them. So these are all things that can help speed the process up. Ideally, there needs to be regular interaction between the environmental and social team and the project engineers. We would like to have those face-to-face, at least on an occasional basis, but we realize we all need to manage our carbon footprints, and that's not always practically feasible. So conference calls will do. But if we sit in on the weekly or the bi-weekly meeting, we can ensure that as fast as you guys are changing your minds about where something's going to go or how something's going to be done, we're going, what does this mean for the environmental and social impact assessment process? And we can feed back to you whether or not we think that that's a problem. If we identify something and we go and tell the engineers, they'll find a solution. That's what engineers do. They engineer out problems. But they won't do that if we don't tell them that there's a problem. Another key area where that interaction is so important is dealing with alternatives. I don't just mean where do you put your tailings dam, it's every single decision that's being made is to be thinking through the environmental and social ramifications. And you can't expect the project engineers to be able to juggle all that in their minds. If we work together, we can do that juggling while they do the technical and economic juggling. If things like localization and project costs are an issue, then there are ways we can get around that. Use your local consultants to do your environmental and social impact assessment, but get either a specialized individual or a consultancy to help with some of these other activities that we've been talking about. And that will enable you to keep your costs down, but make sure that you're managing your risks appropriately. We found that in particular, one area where we really like a face-to-face meeting is what we're calling an environmental and social impact and management measure workshop. We like to hold this towards the end of the impact assessment process because it really ensures that the management plans that come out of the ESIA are realistic, that we can set management measures that are appropriate. But some things to think about. Management plans, if they accompany your ESIA, can become legally binding. So anything in those, you're going to be held to it unless you renegotiate your permit. It can often have commitments that are completely unachievable. Jane and I, we have a training course that we've developed, and one of the exercises that we get people to do is, if we have an actual permit that was issued to one of our clients, we've obviously redacted all the sensitive information out of it. And as part of this training exercise, we give it to everybody in the room, and we ask them to circle all the commitments that might have a material cost associated with them. And it's amazing how many there are. We are talking millions of dollars because of a badly worded permit. The commitments and management plans may be produced by consultants with limited operational experience. You know, that goes as equally for us if we haven't had exposure to what an operational mine is like. It's important that somebody who understands how these things work in practice inputs to the management plans. And they're often not checked by the mining company. They're not interested. It's just get that ESIA submitted, get it approved. That's all we're interested in, is the rubber stamp, without realizing the long-term implications. So back to, oh yes, there we go, drowning with all the commitments. And that has decided not to work. I don't know why that's decided not to work. Never mind. Okay. So after management plans, what's the next thing? Are you going to work? What's this one? There we go. Right. Basically, an environmental and social management system will help support implementation of those management plans. And it's never too early to start establishment of your management system. Now, this does not need to be an overly onerous, highly documented management system to ISO 14000. That is not what we're suggesting that you do. We are suggesting that you develop something that's commensurate with your project risks and that is the people on the ground can actually maintain. That's what you want, something that works. And it's very, very simple. It's a basic plan, do, check, act that any management system is made at. The binding concepts are understanding your project concept, your project context, and that comes out of your environmental and social impact assessment and leadership. When I get involved in project reviews, for example, for the financial institutions, one of the things that I like to do is try and spend some time with the CEO and things like that. You can tell a lot by how committed they are. I was involved in a heavy mineral sands project in Mozambique. We had a lenders meeting in London, and we're all, as I don't know, same number as in this room, all sitting around a table, and the lenders start bombarding the guy with questions. He doesn't call up his environmental manager to stand and answer the question. He stands up and he gives detailed, committed, passionate responses. And I just go, tick, I'm not worried. If he thinks that much about being able to understand and respond to those questions, there's top-level commitment, and this system will be successful. And the last thing on the list is regular engagement with stakeholders and implementation of a grievance mechanism. That's a whole other presentation on itself, so I'm not going to say anything more on it. Right, we're getting towards the end, which is just as well. A good example. There we go. I just want to highlight, I've stolen the slides here from Alice, who presented at the IAI conference in December. So thanks to IAIA, because I've stolen some of the slides that were presented there. Thanks to Alice for doing all the hard work. And thanks to CORE, who's the project. I can actually name this one, because it's great to have a good example. Okay, so what we're dealing with. This is the Republic of Congo. There's Point Noir. You've got a mine site there, and I'm going to talk about these two areas. You've got a conservation area up there and a conservation area down there. This shading here is the marine reserve that's there. So the mine site and inland forest areas, and it's an underground mine that's got various things there. If you've got any questions about this, ask us. The key issue is the overland conveyor, which we've got here, and it's a corridor that's used by elephants, and there's lots of local farmers with their agricultural fields and things like that, and there's lots of other wildlife. And then there is a jetty down here with a sensitive marine environment and fishermen and illegal trawlers. So there's some really interesting challenges for the project. The Overland Conveyor, or OLC, you're going to see that acronym going forward, will operate 24/7, 365 days a year, except of course when it breaks down, which conveyors always do. And the life of the project is 25 years. The jetty is going to be 600 meters long and would be constructed by pile driving, and it's probably going to take about 2 years to construct. So what's some of the context that need to be taken into consideration? The Congo is a biologically diverse and a rich part of the world. And you saw the conservation areas, and here's a couple of examples of things that are in the area. So you've got the forest elephant and the critically endangered humpbacked dolphin. But this part of the Republic of Congo is extremely poor in terms of its community. Everybody is reliant on natural resources for food, warmth, medicine, clothing, housing. There's no sanitation, education is really limited, and people are living on less than $1 a day. So it's hard living. The next two slides talk about how biodiversity was integrated into the project and how we try to find win-win solutions for the environment, local communities, the conservation non-governmental organization or NGOs that were active in the area, and the client. So the first one is looking at terrestrial issues associated with the overland conveyor, which posed a physical barrier to wildlife. And in order to deal with these challenges, SRK, as part of the environmental and social impact assessment, contacted wildlife conservation groups that were working in the area, undertook quite extensive desktop research, and interacted very, very closely with the project engineers. Short memos, 1 or 2 pages long, pretty pictures, that's what we did. Remember that. So, one of the big challenges that we faced is that we needed crossings for elephants that were going to work. But there's no examples out there. There was nothing in the literature that talked about how do you get an elephant underneath the conveyor. Obviously, we all said, oh, well, why don't you bury it? And the project engineers went, no, too much money. So, okay, let's see if we can come up with another solution. So the closest analog we had was large mammal road crossings, but none of those were specifically looking at elephants. So we had bison and various other things like that. Alice can tell you more. And working with the engineers, various things were batted back and forth until a kind of concept was derived with an elevated conveyor that looks a bit like that. And then some of the other management measures that looked at the wider wildlife involved incorporating things like small mammal crossings, so for some of the smaller wildlife, location of where those crossings were, particularly for things like the elephants, so working with the community and where their agricultural lands were and where the wildlife corridors were, which the conservation organization was able to give us. We could work out where the best place was that the elephants would hopefully use, but also keep them away from the community land, which was a real challenge, because the communities were very worried about elephants trampling all over their land, and they're being put under pressure within the conservation area because of logging and charcoal burning and all the usual things that we see. The conveyor was covered to reduce both noise and dust, and sensitivity maps, talked about those, were developed to help with the location issues that I mentioned earlier. There was also a commitment to plant a tree-based corridor all the way along the route of the conveyor. And the biodiversity specialist felt that providing the wildlife crossings were successful, by creating this conveyor, we could keep the wildlife away from the community fields and actually increase the biodiversity in the area and relieve some of the pressure that it was currently facing. Now, this project hasn't gone ahead yet. It's the usual situation of looking for money and all that kind of stuff that goes on with new projects. But if it does, going forward, this is going to be an extreme case of adaptive management. We don't know if these measures are going to work because there is no evidence out there. But the company is committed to detailed monitoring, working very closely with both the communities to make sure that their agricultural fields are protected and with the conservation bodies to try and see how this works. And whatever comes out of it, they'll have to keep adapting. And if worse comes to worse, well, maybe the conveyor will go underground. We don't know. Second one is the marine biodiversity and the jetty. So the project wanted to determine whether or not they needed to schedule construction activities to avoid the peak season of breeding, nesting, etc. for both the dolphin and for the turtles. We've got green, leatherback and olive ridley turtles, all of which were known to be nesting on the beach. So it's really very, very sensitive. You've also got the illegal trawlers and the artisanal fishermen coming in, all of which add more pressure. So again, we went out and interacted with local conservation people in order to try and find ways to manage this, but also to contribute to the local economy of the area and protect it from the illegal trawlers that were going on. Same sort of situation. We didn't know what effect pile driving was going to have on the dolphins. So again, the general consensus that we had, nobody was willing to kind of put their neck out on the line, was we don't think it's an issue, but let's monitor the situation and let's put management measures in place. Some of these things include things like a bubble curtain, permanent marine mammal observers on the end of the jetty as it's being built to say, oh, there's a bunch of dolphins coming close, we've got to stop work, wait till they move away. The establishment of a marine exclusion zone. So in that first slide I showed you where the marine thing is. The idea is to extend that over the concession area where the project's operating and make sure that they can keep, so they'll keep the illegal trawlers away from that area. And that will help the local fishermen. So why is this a good example? Well, biodiversity and the local community were put front and center of the impact assessment. And it was done working hand in glove with the project engineers and the client. It was integrated and it was a two-way communication exchange. Constructive relationships have been built with the NGOs and the local communities, which hopefully will last into construction and operation. And that should help ease the process of approval, which is what the project's currently going through at the moment, and minimize future objections because they understand that we're trying to get a win-win situation. The client was open to the ideas and understood that if they were to get both a social license to operate and manage biodiversity, they needed to look at it in this holistic way. Hopefully, all of this will mean that there's limited opposition to the project, but as I mentioned earlier, only time will tell, and it's a case of whether or not they'll stick to their commitments that they've made. So to conclude, okay, we're back to this slide again. Hopefully now you kind of understand where we're coming to. The relationship is two ways. Ideally, you don't want to be doing your impact assessment at your PFS level. You need to be sort of further along. And one thing I just want to say to anyone who manages projects, the executive summary of the ESIA is not your chapter, environmental and social chapter of your feasibility study. They are different audiences. They need to be written in a different way. So don't just take the executive summary and apply it. So what are my main messages? There's plenty of anecdotal and documented evidence that environmental and social issues are having increased influence on project decision making. There's lots of it out there. I don't need to go into it. With these issues are all making it into various top 10 risks identified in the various industry surveys that we see. If you want to add value to a project and be sure that it has a realistic chance of success, working together is the obvious solution. Thank you very much.